Hey guys, so we're going to keep rolling with period 9 here. We are going to be wrapping up chapter 39 and getting into a little bit of chapter 40 all in this one video. So we've already finished with Reagan, so today I'm going to go through Bush Sr.'s presidency, and then I'll talk about Clinton's election and his domestic agenda as well. So in 1988, obviously Reagan, who was polling with good approval ratings. Obviously, he cannot run for a third term at this point because by this time we have passed the 22nd Amendment. So no more FDRs, just 2 terms for everyone from now on. But in general, people were pleased, in terms of people who actually go to vote, registered voters in general, were pleased with Reagan's presidency. They were pleased with the conservative movement that had been gaining popularity. They were pleased with his leadership, with the end of the Cold War coming, all of these things. So things were looking relatively good for the Republican Party in general. So this looked like, their election to win, and it will be. So Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, which is Bush Sr., H.W. Bush, he decided to run for president on the Republican ticket, and the Democrats nominated the governor of Massachusetts, whose name was Michael Dukakis. And in general, the election, swirled around economic issues. That was the most common and most important thing for voters at the time, as it almost always is, depending on what's happening. Every presidential election, Gallup always polls voters. What's the number one issue that you're thinking of when you go to vote today? And most times whenever we see voters show up, they say the economy. That's typically the top one, and it was the top one in 1988, and people had been pleased with Reagan's economic leadership for the most part throughout the 80s, but we were starting to see that savings and loans crisis creep up on us towards the late 80s, which had come from some of that deregulation. So it was starting to become a concern once again. And in general, throughout the campaign, Bush polled, with a general lead above Dukakis. Like I said, pretty much the whole time. He, called him a Massachusetts liberal, and Bush was a Texas neocon, and that was something that people generally at the time, this, the middle class silent majority voting base, that's something that they were leaning towards. So, ultimately, you can see there on the map, he did win the popular vote and the electoral vote, and he'll be the first vice president to be elected president while vice president since 1836. So it has been like 150 years since this has happened. So that was a pretty big deal. In addition to that, since President Bush was elected here in 88, no candidate has managed to equal or surpass his share of the electoral or popular votes since. No other presidential candidate has done that. So people were putting a lot of trust and a lot of faith into Bush here. And a lot of it was just carry over from Reagan. Honestly, had he not been Reagan's vice president, he would have had a much harder time getting himself elected. But because he was connecting himself to the Reagan campaign, in general, that worked out pretty well for Bush. So Bush's presidency is going to mark a new decade, right? We're getting into the 90s, and this is definitely carrying us into a new era. The 90s are going to be very different in terms of our domestic policy, economic agenda, foreign policy. All of this is going to look very different from the United States, and it's really because we're in this like post Cold War foreign policy. For the last 50 to 70 years, our top priority has been stopping the spread of communism. Well, communism's no longer a threat, so where's our focus going? And we're going to see it go to several things. We're going to see it go to peacekeeping missions in Somalia. We're going to get involved in the fight against apartheid in South Africa. We're going to ramp up the war on drugs across North and South America, and that's going to have, sweeping repercussions. But overwhelmingly, the largest and the thing that's going to dominate our foreign policy from here in 1990 to present day is going to be our involvement in the Middle East. Now, we know that our involvement in the Middle East is not new. Remember, after the Soviets invaded Afghanistan in 1980, we've been arming and funding various groups throughout the Middle East. We've had a strong alliance with Israel since they were founded in the late 40s. So we've been involved in the Middle East, but not to this capacity and not necessarily always for these reasons. At this point, and something that you probably already know if you've ever listened to anything involved, explaining our involvement in the Middle East, then you know that 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, the reason behind our involvement in the Middle East is almost always access to our oil supply. And that's going to be what gets us into it here, what's going to get us into a war, and what's going to get us into conflict and military action over and over and over in the Middle East for pretty much the next 30 years. So, Persian Gulf War, new war for us. This starts the whole situation begins on August 2nd of 1990. On that day, Iraq invaded Kuwait with about 150,000 troops. Now, what does that have to do with us? If you look at a map, Iraq and Kuwait border each other. Kuwait is a very, very small country just south of Iraq, and it borders along the eastern side of Saudi Arabia and the southern side of Iraq, and they have a massive amount of oil in that tiny, tiny country of Kuwait. Remember, they're one of the 5 founding members of OPEC. And why would Iraq invade Kuwait? They're both members of OPEC. Why would they not be allies? Well, at the time, Iraq, since 1979, had been under the control of a dictator named Saddam Hussein. I'm very confident you've heard of Saddam. And at this point, the same reason we're going to get involved, he wants to conquer Kuwait's oil deposits. If he has control of Iraq's oil as well as Kuwait's, then he has control of 20% of the world's oil supply, which is massive. And with that, he can control the market. Now, next to Iraq and Kuwait, I mentioned is Saudi Arabia. And you can see this there on the map. Saudi Arabia has even more oil, and it's very close. And what we don't want, what no one wants, is for Saddam to have these 2 countries and then turn his attention to Saudi Arabia. That would be very bad. So Bush launches a plan to pitch to the UN, because remember, this is a similar situation to Korea, right? Like, this has nothing directly to do with us, but the implications could affect us. So it's not necessarily anything the United States, we don't need to declare war against Iraq. They didn't attack us, but their actions are belligerent and dangerous to other nations and other nations of the UN. So we pitched to the UN, hey, this is something the UN needs to get involved in. We need to send troops to Iraq. We need to protect Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and we need to push Saddam and his people back. And they agree. And the bulk of that force, though, is obviously going to be funded by the United States. Of the 700,000 troops sent to the border of Saudi Arabia and Iraq, 500,000 of them were American. So if you look at the map, if you see those little black dots along the southern part of Saudi Arabia, that's originally where American troops, UN troops, basically began to line up. We're not entering Iraq's space because we are trying to, here in the beginning, just intimidate them. Like, maybe they'll just retreat if we see that we're here. We'd hope that the presence of these troops would be a threat enough to scare Saddam out of Kuwait, but he but he, being Bush, was prepared to use these troops. You know, it wasn't an empty threat. We'll use them if we had to. And ultimately, they decided that they do. In January of 1991, General Colin Powell, who you see there on the slide, who will eventually be George W. Bush, his Secretary of Defense, he began to execute a 5-week aerial assault on Iraqi forces in Kuwait. And then on February 23rd, he leads those UN forces into Kuwait. Iraqi forces were very much outnumbered, so most of them surrendered or fled immediately. And there ensued what we call Operation Desert Storm, which was a 5-day ground war to push Iraq back into their own space. By the time we get into, we actually cross the border into Iraq, Iraq had already lost about 25,000 soldiers. In total, in just Operation Desert Storm, only about 128 Americans died. And so we pushed the Iraqi soldiers back into Iraq, which was the goal. So now we are faced with a few options, a little fork in the road here. What do we do? What's the next move? Do we call it mission accomplished and leave, because we said we just wanted Iraq to get back to Iraq and leave Kuwait and Saudi Arabia alone, which is what we have now done? Or do we remain, try to invade the capital and topple Saddam's regime, potentially replace him with a new leader? What do we do here? And ultimately, Bush decided, no, we call it mission accomplished. We said we were going to get in, we were going to put Iraq back in their house. We did that. Now it's time for us to go home. And overwhelmingly, his approval rating will skyrocket due to that decision. People supported that. That was exactly what they wanted. They did not want another Vietnam, another war with no end date that they didn't truly understand why they were even involved in. And overwhelmingly, people were pleased. The Persian Gulf War ended up being sort of like a clean cut, like, here we go. However, we're not going to just like leave and now we don't have to worry about Saddam. You know, spoiler, he's going to come up again, and we are going to continue to have to monitor the situation, because now we know what type of leader he is. That he's going to be interested in invading other countries, and that he's going to be interested in, tapping into that Middle Eastern oil supply, and that would have, sweeping, damaging effects on our economy. We already saw that during the OPEC embargo through the 1970s. So that's definitely something that people were very pleased with Bush's leadership during, was the Persian Gulf War. Now, a few other things worth mentioning to remember about Bush's overall administration as far as his domestic agenda goes. A couple of things. One, in 1990, he will sign into law the Americans with Disabilities Act, which was like sweeping regulations on creating an equitable and equal space for people with disabilities, whether it be physical, mental, intellectual, developmental, all of those things, which has been in place ever since. He'll also appoint a new Supreme Court Justice, Clarence Thomas, who his I guess not, what's the word I'm looking for? Not appointment or nomination. His confirmation hearing. That's what I'm looking for. His confirmation hearing ended up being very dramatic. He was accused by a former employee named Anita Hill of sexually harassing her for several years. She was they do big investigations into anyone who's appointed to this lifetime position, and through this investigation her name came up, as did several other women who he had sexually harassed. Anita was the only one who had the courage to come testify before Congress, though. So she did come testify before Congress. Overwhelmingly, though, neither Democrats nor Republicans put much weight in her testimony, and Clarence Thomas was confirmed regardless. Bush also got into a bit of a sticky situation with tax reform. When he ran for president in 1988, he very famously said, "Read my lips, I will not raise taxes." That was one of the things he said multiple times. And then ultimately, Bush did raise taxes. And you can imagine the media had a field day with that clip on the news, him saying, "Read my lips, I'm not going to raise taxes," and then immediately raising taxes. So that was definitely something that caused a lot of people to be like, he's untrustworthy, and things like that. As far as outside of the Persian Gulf War foreign policy goes, I already mentioned several things. One, the war on drugs. Nixon actually started the war on drugs. Reagan escalated the war on drugs, and Bush will continue to keep that going. Strategy to go after both buyers and sellers. He was able to arrest one of the leading financiers of the Colombian drug cartel during his presidency. He sent 12,000 troops to invade Panama and arrest the dictator of Panama, Manuel Noriega, who had been charged with drug trafficking and bringing drugs into the United States. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He was one of the top drug cartel members in the entire world. And so to track him down, arrest him, and successfully imprison him was definitely a big deal. At this time, our relationship with China is also starting to take a turn. In 1989, students in Beijing held a massive pro-democracy protests in Tiananmen Square, and the Chinese government on June 4th rolled tanks in and slaughtered hundreds of protesters. We don't actually know how many people were killed. We can estimate off of some of the photographs that were able to be leaked, but the Chinese government has kept the entire situation very, very hush-hush. To this day, the incident in Tiananmen Square, you cannot Google in China without a VPN. And they don't talk about it. They just say, something bad happened here. That's literally the extent to which the conversation happens. But it was international news, and it opens up more discussions. We had started to trade more and more with China, and people were feeling good about it. But this sort of brings everybody back to reality. Like, yeah, trading with China is great, but let us not all forget the massive amount of human rights atrocities that they commit on a daily basis. So Bush did suspend all arms sales to China and said, we're not going to sell you guns and weapons if all you're going to do is use them to kill innocent protesters. But we still remained tied to them economically and politically. As far as fighting apartheid in South Africa, Bush and plenty of American companies took the support, the stance of supporting anti-apartheid leader Nelson Mandela, who was finally released from prison in 1990 after he had been jailed in 1962 for basically just being the leader of this anti-apartheid movement. Many American companies, private companies around the world started pulling their money out of South Africa in protest to support Mandela, which crippled the South African economy and put pressure on their government to finally undo that. So ultimately in 1994, apartheid ended, and Nelson Mandela was elected as their leader in the first free elections held in South Africa. And then the last sort of major moment for Bush foreign policy was Operation Restore Hope, which was in Somalia. Rival warlords in Somalia had been fighting for some time. So Bush decided to send peacekeeping troops in to distribute food and supplies to the civilians who had been caught in the middle. So that was something that, a peacekeeping mission, humanitarian missions always look good in terms of military action. So Bush's first term is down. Obviously, in 1992, he's going to run for re-election. He had a serious lead in the polls after the Persian Gulf War. People had a lot of support for that. Who's he running against? Well, the Democrats are going to nominate the governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton. A little background on Bill Clinton. His dad died when he was pretty young, so he's mostly raised by his mom and his grandparents, who really pushed the importance of education. Very much, Southern Democrat, Southern liberal, and we'll see that play out in quite a few ways during his presidency. After a few months, though, Clinton took a surge in public opinion polls, and that was due to the LA riots that broke out through the spring and summer of 1992. So a little background on the LA riots. This began actually with the arrest and attack of Rodney King. Rodney King lived in California, in Los Angeles. He had a history of substance abuse issues. He was arrested or pulled over for drunk driving, and ensued in basically like a high-speed chase with police. When he was finally pulled over, he was pulled from the car, kicked, beaten with batons so badly. You can look up the video on YouTube, and if you are not very squeamish when it comes to like real violence footage of that, then I definitely suggest that you do, because it really puts into perspective. You see how it makes total sense as to why people reacted the way they did. The attack was extremely brutal. Rodney King was left with a fractured, and he did not fight back at all, for the record. It was just, straight up clean cut police brutality there. He had a fractured facial bone, broken right ankle, 11 skull fractures, brain damage, broken teeth, kidney failure. And in 2020, if you see someone getting attacked by police, you pull out your phone and you record it, right? It'll take, or you live stream it, it'll take 0 seconds to reach other people all over the world. But in 1992, that was not the case. It was rare for someone to just like have a video camera on them when something like this happens. But that was the case when Rodney King was attacked. A man named George Holliday did manage to capture the whole thing on video. After a couple of weeks, he finally agreed to sell that video to the press. And after it aired on TV, it was pretty clear that some people needed to be arrested. So millions of people called for the arrest of these officers. They were arrested, put on trial for assault, and on April 29th of 1992, they were found not guilty on all charges. People lost their minds. Within a few hours, fires were started, homes and stores were being looted, people were being attacked. The LA riots lasted for nearly a week. Up to 60 people were killed. We're not exactly sure of all of the numbers. 11,000 people arrested, over $1 billion in damages. And it will increase a lot more. It will just cause more problems for the city of Los Angeles. It will increased tensions between African Americans and other minorities like Korean Americans in LA, because Korean businesses were attacked during the riots and they blamed the African American community. But it will provide unity between the Hispanic population in LA and African Americans, because police brutality is something that both of those communities face. The National Guard was finally brought in to stop the riots, and Bush signed a bill to give money to the people whose homes and businesses had been destroyed. But for the most part, people were very unhappy with how Bush handled the situation. I mean, this whole thing went on for a week before the National Guard was brought in, and that really was more of a governor of California move and not necessarily a president of the United States move. And it, of course, opens up discussions about how we treat disasters in low-income communities, but it also opens up discussions about police brutality and equality in the United States. There was this perception by so many people that, the civil rights movement ended, so we must have equality, but anyone who's not white knows that that's not true. And so this exposed a lot of that. Ultimately, people were very unhappy with how Bush handled it, and it will reflect very badly on him in the campaign. As for Rodney King, he did sue the city of Los Angeles, won $3.8 million. He invested a majority of that into a record label that flopped. After more arrests of drunk driving in 1993, he crashed his car into a wall. In 1995, he ran over his wife with a car. In 2003, he was arrested for drunk driving, drove into a house, broke his pelvis. In 2011, on the 20th anniversary of his 91 arrest, he was arrested for driving erratically and driving without a license. And then in 2012, he was found dead in his swimming pool with traces of alcohol, cocaine, marijuana, and PCP in his system. So unfortunately for Rodney King, what could have been perhaps an opportunity at a start of a clean and healthy new life, he was not able to overcome his substance abuse issues, and they ultimately did take his life. But as for Bush, we're starting to see some, wonky situations with the economy. Republicans had ended the Cold War, and that carried them through the '88 election, but that wasn't, the argument anymore. Now people don't have to worry about the Democrats standing up to the Soviet Union. So in an attempt to appear as a stronger party, a lot of the Democrats' platform is going to change to being tough on crime, and that was something that people really wanted coming out of these LA riots. So at this point, in general, people were unhappy with most parties. So things look pretty neck and neck between Clinton and Bush here. Something that's finally going to push, though, Clinton over the edge is actually going to be a third party candidate named Ross Perot. He was fiscally conservative and socially liberal, so sort of like the best of both worlds. He supported social programs but didn't want to spend too much money. That's definitely something that most people feel. But he's a third party candidate, so he's not going to win, but he's just going to pull votes. The question is, who does he pull the votes from? And ultimately, he'll pull Republican votes, which will help Clinton. Clinton only got 43% of the popular vote, which is not anywhere close to a majority, but he took home 370 electoral votes, which is what he needed. So we are seeing a new presidency here with Bill Clinton, and this signals a huge generational change. He's going to be the first Democrat in over 50 years to be elected to a second term. He represents what history and the press called at the time the New Democrat. Unfortunately for him, he will constantly be surrounded by controversy from beginning to end of his presidency. And of course, I'll get into some of that. Who would I be if I left out the controversy of it all? He had a very progressive agenda focused on economic policy, worked closely with Republicans. The Speaker of the House of Representatives through his presidency was Newt Gingrich, who, if you pay attention to politics, you definitely know who he is. He's run for president a few times and is a commentator on several different news channels. But they worked very well together. And even though Clinton was a Democrat, he had no problem working across the aisle. He did, several things that might have been considered more conservative agendas. He signed into law, like the Defense of Marriage Act, which established that marriage was only between a man and a woman. He signed Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which banned gay people from the military. So those are definitely things that would have aligned along more with the right side of the political spectrum. So you might consider Clinton a a Democrat in name only, but either way, he will cut spending, increase taxes on the wealthy, tried to revamp healthcare. He created a special task force led by his First Lady Hillary Clinton to tackle high healthcare costs. Unfortunately for everyone, it was one of the worst healthcare plans ever proposed. Was what she and her team came up with. Critics really attacked the plan, even critics of their own party. It was very expensive and very complicated. Congress never even voted on the plan. They just let it die. Clinton will also sign the Brady bill, which this will be some gun control and crime reform. The Brady bill instituted a mandatory waiting period on gun ownership, so where gun vendors could do a background check before the buyer receives a gun. And in 94, he signed the 94 crime bill, which banned 19 kinds of assault rifles and created over 100,000 law enforcement jobs, which those are good things. But one thing that it did do is it also began to institute mandatory sentencing. And that 94 crime bill is an easy thing to point to when we look at our current mass incarceration crisis that we're experiencing. Now, a lot of the rules and regulations that got put in place in the 94 crime bill are directly responsible for that. A couple of events that will actually happen after this 94 crime bill, but will cause for both Democrats and Republicans to continue to take this stance of wanting to be tough on crime. The 90s is definitely kind of a violent time period. Through the 1970s and 80s, we will see the murder rate in the United States continue to increase. And when we get to the 90s, we're going to start to see some of our first like mass massacres start to take place in the United States. And as you know now, this will only be a trend that continues to grow. It's truly a newer phenomenon. And so the first major incident was a terrorist attack, actually, in 1995, April 19th, 1995 at 9:02 a.m. A truck bomb exploded in front of a federal building in Oklahoma City. The entire north side of the building was blown apart. You can see it, that photograph there on the bottom left. 168 people were killed, unfortunately, and included in that count of 168 on that north side of the building was the building's daycare. So about 20 children who were in the daycare on that day were also killed. This was the deadliest act of terrorism in the United States until 9/11 will happen in 2001. And so who did this? Obviously, standard with terrorist attacks, the initial suspect was Middle Eastern terrorist groups, but that was not who was responsible. It was actually two white guys, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. Timothy McVeigh was actually a veteran of the Persian Gulf War, claimed to be inspired by the Waco, Texas incident. If you don't know about that, I encourage you to Google it. But there's no real reason. There have been many questions. McVeigh and Nichols were both asked when they were arrested why they did it, and we never got real answers, nothing definitive other than they were just both nut jobs. But McVeigh began actually planning this long ahead. Back in September, he started purchasing large amounts of fertilizer, stored them in a rental shed. If you don't know fertilizer, there's a chemical in the soil called ammonium nitrate, which is like the main ingredient for making a bomb. He stole any other supplies that he needed. On April 17th, he rented a truck, loaded it with 5,000 pounds of that fertilizer. And then 2 days later, he drove it in front of the building, parked it, lit the fuse, left the keys, walked across a parking lot into an alley, and then took off running. There were many reports of people seeing McVeigh with a third person during these planning stages. And even potentially another person exiting the truck the morning of the attack. And we know that person couldn't have been Terry Nichols because he was somewhere else. So there has been some conspiracy of was there a third person involved, but there was never, definitive proof as to who that third person might have been. So they were both arrested and convicted and sentenced to death. They were both executed. The second major event here that you should know, as it's going to unfortunately be the start of a long trend, is the Columbine massacre. And today, April 20th, the day I'm recording this, is the anniversary of that. April 20th, 1999. So two students, Eric Harris, who is 18 years old, and Dylan Klebold, who is 17 years old, attended Columbine High School in Colorado. They planned this attack for over a year. Their plan was to kill everyone in their entire school. That was the goal. That was the plan. And they had a fairly, thought out way of making that happen. They were going to set off propane bombs in the cafeteria at the time when the most amount of people would be in the cafeteria. So after the propane bombs went off and killed people in the cafeteria, they hoped that people exiting the cafeteria would then, be pushed down the hallway, where then Eric and Dylan would enter the school with firearms and other explosives and kill everyone. When the morning of the attack came, the propane bombs fortunately did not go off the way that they were supposed to. And luckily, no one in the cafeteria was killed with those bombs. However, Eric and Dylan did enter the school. They shot they ultimately were responsible for the death of 15 people, 12 students, one teacher, and then themselves. They were both committed suicide. The bulk of the massacre took place in the school's library, where Eric and Dylan sort of barricaded themselves for several hours during the attack. And everything that took place in Columbine High School that day is recorded, audio and video, because they had a massive security system, which clearly proved to be irrelevant during the attack. And so we know exactly what they said to each other. And so because of that, we know a lot more about the situation than we might in a typical school shooting, since then. And we know, though, that that there was a lot of back and forth about whether or not to kill themselves. They debated it. One of them didn't want to. The other sort of, said, if you don't kill yourself, the cops are just going to kill us. There's no way we're getting out of this. So ultimately, they did choose to take their own lives. So this is going to be the first real mass shooting at a school, our first real school shooting. And this is going to open up so many conversations that we're still having to this day, conversations we've not been able to provide true solutions and answers for. The first is bullying. One of the reasons we know Eric and Dylan went down this path is because they struggled with depression, mental illness, and feeling like outcasts. Is that a reason to massacre 15 people? No, obviously not. But it will be something that comes up whenever people ask, why did this happen? That's one thing that we know was a contributing factor. The second thing that we will begin talking about is school safety, school security. No one had ever really considered that somebody might enter a school with propane bombs and explosive devices and firearms, and in an attempt to murder everyone. So this is going to start to be, especially in a predominantly white suburban area. There were higher securities in low income, high crime neighborhoods. Like I'm sure that the security protocols that some schools in Los Angeles took or New York were very different from the security protocols that schools in suburban Colorado took. And so it just made it clear that something like this could happen anywhere at any time. And then the last thing that it will raise a lot of awareness about is access to firearms. And that was and this is even after that 94 crime bill and Brady bill. So this was after some pretty large gun control reform bills were passed. So it just showed like that just those bills are not enough. We need more plans, and we're continuing to learn more and more about that now as we have entered an era of mass shootings. And unfortunately, we still haven't truly been able to come up with a real solution.